Here is a question that should bother anybody who loves this game. How does a man finish his professional career third all-time in total rebounds with 17,834 boards across 2 leagues and 10th all-time in points scored with 29,580 and still end up remembered less clearly than players he flat-out outperformed? That man is Moses Malone, and the numbers tell you he belongs in any conversation about the greatest big men who ever lived. He won 3 Most Valuable Player awards. He swept his way to a championship. He even told the world it was coming before it happened, in 4 little words that basketball never forgot. And yet, somehow, when people sit around and trade stories about the legends, his name comes up quieter than it should, softer, like an afterthought to a career that was anything but. That is the mystery we are going to chase. Not a fall from grace, not a scandal that tore him down. Something stranger than that. A giant who built a mountain of production and never quite got the myth to match it. He was called the chairman of the boards, a relentless worker who punished the glass for nearly 20 years. But he had no flashy persona, no easy catchphrase to sell, no carefully built legend. He just worked. And in an era that was starting to reward personality as much as performance, the quiet ones got left behind in the storytelling. He was born on March the 23rd, 1955, in Petersburg, Virginia. He passed away on September the 13th, 2015, in Norfolk, Virginia, at the age of 60. Between those 2 dates lived one of the most productive careers the sport has ever seen. But before he was the chairman of the boards, he was a 2-year-old boy in Petersburg, watching his father walk out the door for the last time. And that absence, that empty space in the house, shaped everything that came after it. To understand the man, you have to start in a working-class home in Petersburg, Virginia, where money was tight and the future was uncertain. Moses was an only child, raised primarily by his mother, Mary. And Mary herself had left school after finishing only the 5th grade, so this was not a household with diplomas on the wall or easy comfort to lean on. It was a household built on survival, on discipline, on doing what had to be done. When Moses was just 2 years old, his father was forced out of the home because of his drinking. He moved away, all the way to Texas, and the boy grew up without a father in the house. Think about what that does to a child. There is no man at the dinner table. There is no second income, no backup, no safety net. There is a mother with a 5th grade education trying to raise a son alone in a world that promises nothing. And here is where the psychology starts. The psychology that runs underneath this entire story. A boy in that situation learns one lesson early and learns it for good. Nobody is going to hand you anything. If you want it, you go and you get it. You take it. You outwork everybody else in the room until the thing you want has no choice but to come to you. Hold on to that idea, because it is going to matter. Because the literal definition of an offensive rebound, the skill that made Moses Malone famous, is refusing to accept that a miss is final. It is going back up again and again until the ball is yours. That was not just a basketball move. For Moses, that was a way of living that started in a fatherless house in Petersburg long before he ever touched a professional court. People would later mistake his quiet for blandness. They had no idea that quiet was forged in something hard. And that hungry, silent boy was about to walk into Petersburg High School and turn an ordinary program into something the whole state of Virginia could not beat. Not once, not for 50 straight games. When Moses Malone got to Petersburg High School and started playing for the Crimson Wave, something happened that towns talk about for generations. The team did not just win, it stopped losing entirely. Across his final 2 years, that program went undefeated. 50 wins, back-to-back, and 2 straight Virginia State championships. 50 games, and not a single defeat. Let that sink in. Before this young man was old enough to legally sign a professional contract, he had already become a phenomenon. He was the kind of high school player who bends an entire program around him, who turns ordinary teammates into champions just by standing in the middle of the floor and refusing to let anybody score over him or rebound around him. And word travels fast about a talent like that. The recruiting frenzy that followed was enormous. College basketball's biggest names came calling for a teenager out of a single-parent home in Petersburg, a kid with no financial cushion underneath him, carrying the weight of an entire community's expectations on his shoulders. Imagine being that young and having the most powerful coaches in the country telling you that you are the answer to their dreams. In the end, it looked settled. Moses signed a letter of intent to play college basketball at the University of Maryland for the legendary head coach Lefty Driesel. On paper, the next step was certain. Maryland thought they had landed the prize of the entire recruiting class. Everyone assumed the path was clear. High school, then college ball under Driesel, then on to the pros, the way everybody did it. But that is not how this story goes. Maryland thought they had him. The recruiters thought they had him. And then a struggling professional league, hungry and desperate and willing to break every unwritten rule, made an offer that would rewrite how a teenager could turn pro, and it would break Lefty Driesel's heart. In the 1974 ABA draft, the Utah Stars of the American Basketball Association selected Moses Malone in the 3rd round. And Moses made a decision that, at the time, was almost unthinkable. He skipped college altogether. He decided to become a professional straight out of high school, becoming the first player in modern professional basketball to enter the league directly from high school. Understand what that word modern is carrying there. This was not a small thing. This was a teenager walking past the entire college system, past the expectations, past the safe and accepted route everyone took, and betting his whole future on himself. There was no blueprint for this. He was writing it. And the money made the gamble real. Utah signed him to a 5-year contract worth $1 million to begin his career in the 1974-75 season. $1 million in the mid-1970s. For a young man raised by a mother with a 5th-grade education, in a working-class home with no cushion underneath it, that was not just money. That was the door blown wide open. That was every hard lesson from that fatherless house in Petersburg suddenly paying off all at once. But here is the physical reality of the gamble. Moses stood 6 feet 10 inches tall, but he was a skinny 215 pounds when he arrived. He was not yet built for the brutal, grinding work of playing center against grown men. So he started out at forward, and he set about bulking up his body until he could survive in the paint. Think about that. A teenager who skipped college entirely, walking straight into a man's professional league, betting his still-growing body and his entire future on the belief that he could take whatever they threw at him. The bet paid off almost immediately. The teenager became an all-star. But the league that gave him his start was already quietly dying beneath his feet. The doubters expected a teenager to drown in professional basketball. Instead, Moses Malone swam. In that first season with the Utah Stars, he was named an ABA All-Star and earned ABA All-Rookie honors. A kid who should have been a freshman in a college dormitory was instead being recognized as one of the best young professionals in an entire league. The gamble was not just paying off, it was looking like genius. He was so good, so fast, that the established league took notice. After his rookie season, the Chicago Bulls of the NBA actually tried to draft him in the 10th round of the 1975 NBA draft. But that selection was ruled ineligible because at the time, the NBA had a 4-year rule on the books that was supposed to keep players in college. So even as he was thriving, Moses was already a walking test case for the rules of the sport, a young man the system did not quite know how to handle. But while Moses was rising, the ground underneath him was crumbling. The ABA was a league running on fumes, bleeding money, with franchises that could barely keep the lights on. And the next season, the 75-76 campaign, the trouble came straight to his doorstep. Moses had been sidelined with a leg injury when the Utah Stars simply folded, collapsed completely, just 16 games into the season. The team he had bet his future on was gone. And then came the part that tells you everything about how little control a young player had back then. To help pay down the debts the failing Stars had piled up, Moses was sold to another ABA team, the Spirits of St. Louis. Not traded for players, sold like an asset to cover what the franchise owed. A teenage all-star, one of the brightest young talents in basketball, reduced to a line item on a dying team's books. And that was only the beginning of the carousel, because the league itself was about to make a decision that would leave Moses caught in the shuffle of basketball history. Picture being 20 years old, hurt, and learning that you no longer belong to yourself. That was the position Moses Malone found himself in after the Utah Stars collapsed. He had not asked for the team to fold. He had not run the books into the ground. He was simply a young man with a bad leg sitting on the sidelines when the whole operation came apart around him. And when the dust settled, the men who ran the league did the cold, practical thing. They sold him to the Spirits of St. Louis, like furniture being moved out of a building before the doors got locked. Think about how that lands on a kid raised to believe that hard work is the one thing nobody can take from you. He had done everything right. He had outworked the doubt, made the all-star team as a teenager, proven the gamble was no accident. And none of it gave him a single ounce of control over where he played or for whom. In the business of professional basketball in the 1970s, a young star could be the most valuable thing on the floor and still be treated as nothing more than a debt to be settled. And the carousel was only spinning faster. After that season, the two warring leagues finally made peace. The ABA and the NBA agreed to merge, and a handful of the surviving ABA teams were folded into the bigger league. But the Spirits of St. Louis, the very team Moses had just been sold to, were not among the franchises chosen to come along. Just like that, the club holding his contract was shut out of the future of the sport. Moses was caught in the shuffle of basketball history through no fault of his own, attached to a team that had no seat at the new table. And it gets more tangled than that. Before any of this had fully played out, the NBA's New Orleans Jazz had already laid their own claim to him, selecting Moses in a December 1975 draft set aside for ABA players of undergraduate age. So now you had one ownership claim stacked on top of another, a young man pulled between leagues and franchises and paperwork he never signed. Two leagues, multiple teams, and a thicket of competing claims, all swirling around one quiet 20-year-old who just wanted to play. And the strangest twist of all was still coming, because the next team to grab him, in a special draft built just to sort out this mess, would pick him high and never intend to play him for a single minute. To untangle the wreckage of the gone ABA, the NBA held what they called a dispersal draft, a way of sorting the orphaned players from the folded teams into new homes. And in that 1976 dispersal draft, the Portland Trail Blazers used the 5th overall pick on Moses Malone. On the surface, that sounds like respect, a top 5 selection, a young big man valued ahead of dozens of others. But the truth was almost insulting. Portland did not draft Moses to play him. They drafted him to trade him. The Blazers already had a loaded front court, Maurice Lucas, Bill Walton, and Lloyd Neal, and they figured a young center like Moses would barely get off the bench. So they treated a future 3-time most valuable player as a trade chip, an asset to flip for something they wanted more. And flip him, they did. Before the first game of the 1976-77 season, Portland shipped Moses to the Buffalo Braves in exchange for a future first-round draft pick and $232,000 in cash. A first-round pick and a check. That was the going rate, in the eyes of the men running things, for one of the most relentless young players in the entire sport. But Buffalo was no permanent home either. Moses suited up for the Braves and played a grand total of 2 games. 2. Because the Braves could not meet his demands for playing time, and a player with his hunger was not about to sit and wait. So Buffalo turned around and traded him again, this time to the Houston Rockets. Stop and add up the chaos. In roughly 2 years, Moses Malone had signed with Utah, been sold to St. Louis, claimed by New Orleans, drafted by Portland, traded to Buffalo, and finally shipped to Houston. 6 different franchises had held some kind of stake in him before he had even found a place to settle down and grow. And here is the irony that should sting every front office that touched him along the way. Every single team that let him go, that figured he was expendable, that treated him as a line item or a trade piece, every one of them was passing on a player who would win the league's highest individual honor, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Houston was supposed to be just another stop on a chaotic carousel. Another temporary address for a kid the business kept passing around. Instead, it became the place where the skinny, traded-around teenager built himself into the most punishing rebounding machine the game had ever seen. Something changed in Houston. The skinny forward, who had arrived in the pros at a slight 215 pounds, had been building his body, layering on muscle, hardening himself for the war that gets fought under the basket. And in a Rockets uniform, the transformation became complete. He stopped being a young man surviving against grown men and became the grown man everyone else had to survive. This is where the nickname was born, the chairman of the boards. And it fit him better than any title basketball has ever handed out. A chairman runs the meeting. A chairman owns the room. And on the floor, in the painted area where the bodies collide and the elbows fly, nobody owned the room like Moses Malone. He attacked the offensive glass with a relentlessness the league had simply never seen at that volume. Now, think about what an offensive rebound really is. Your team shoots. Your team misses. The play, by every normal expectation, is over. The other side gets the ball back. But the offensive rebounder refuses to accept that. He goes back up. He fights through bodies, reads the angle of the carom, and takes a possession that everyone else has already given up on. It is the purest refusal in all of basketball, a refusal to let a miss be the final word. And does that not sound exactly like the boy from Petersburg? The child raised to understand that nobody hands you anything, that you go back up and back up until the thing you want has no choice but to be yours. The hardest lesson of his early life had become the most valuable skill in his game. The numbers backed up every bit of it. Moses set a then NBA record with 437 offensive rebounds in a single season. And as if to prove it was no fluke, he later went and surpassed even that mark himself. No one was chasing those misses harder. No one was turning gone plays back into live ones at that rate. But there was a warning buried in all that pounding. During his second NBA season, doctors found a stress fracture in his right foot, and it cost him the final 23 games of the year. It was the first real signal that a body, even one as strong as his, can only absorb so much collision. A style built entirely on physical punishment was going to demand a physical price, paid out slowly over the long years ahead. But that reckoning was still far off, because by the next season, the kid that nobody's franchise had wanted to keep would be standing alone at the very top of the entire NBA. The 1978-79 season is when Moses Malone went from very good to undeniable. He averaged 24.8 points a game. He shot a career-best .540 from the field, a remarkable mark of efficiency for a man doing his work in the chaos of the paint. And he led the entire league in rebounding at 17.6 boards a night. Put those numbers together, and there is only one conclusion. That season, Moses Malone was named the most valuable player of the National Basketball Association. Sit with the size of that. The teenager who skipped college and bet on himself. The player sold off to pay a gone team's debts. The kid traded for a draft pick and a cash payment, passed around by 6 franchises before he turned 22. That same young man was now officially the best player in the best basketball league in the world. Every front office that had treated him as expendable had to watch him collect the sport's highest individual prize. And inside that MVP season lived a number that still stops people cold. Moses grabbed 587 offensive rebounds in that single year, an all-time single-season record. 587 times his own team missed a shot, and 587 times Moses went and got it back. To understand how staggering that is, you have to picture the sheer effort behind each one. The box outs broken, the bodies leaned through, the second and third efforts on a single trip down the floor. The single-game proof of his appetite came on the 9th of February that season against the New Orleans Jazz, the very franchise that had once tried to lay a claim on him. That night, Moses pulled down 37 rebounds in a single game. 37. A career high, and a number that sounds almost made up by today's standards. It was a one-man clinic in domination, delivered against a team that had once held a piece of his rights and let it slip away. This was the full flowering of the chairman of the boards. Not a specialist, not a one-trick big man, but the most valuable all-around force in the entire sport. And yet here is the quiet tragedy already taking shape. He was winning everything that could be measured, and almost nothing that gets remembered in legend. He let his game speak, and the game spoke loudly. But he himself stayed silent, and silence does not build mythology. There was, however, one mountain a player like Moses still had to climb. Individual greatness is one thing. carrying a team all the way to the NBA Finals is another. And in just a couple of seasons, he would do exactly that, almost single-handedly. By the 1980-81 season, Moses Malone had a new mission, whether he ever said it out loud or not. The individual awards were piling up, but a great player gets measured in the end by how far he can carry the people around him. And what Moses did in the 1981 playoffs is one of the most underappreciated one-man hauling jobs in the history of the league. The Rockets were not a juggernaut. They were a team that needed someone to drag them deep into the postseason on sheer will, and Moses did the dragging. The defining moment came in the decisive Game 5 of the Western Conference Finals against the Kansas City Kings, with a trip to the NBA Finals hanging in the balance. In that game, Moses delivered 36 points and 11 rebounds, a heavyweight performance in the exact moment his team needed it most. He bullied his way to the basket, owned the glass, and willed Houston into the championship round. And so, a team that had no business being there found itself in the 1981 NBA Finals, staring across the floor at one of the proudest franchises in all of sports, the Boston Celtics. This was the deep end, the brightest lights the game can offer, and Moses did not shrink from a single moment of it. Look at what he did across that final series. He averaged 22.3 points a game. He pulled down 15.7 rebounds a night. And he protected the rim with 2.2 blocks per contest. Those are dominant, two-way numbers from a man playing at the absolute summit of the sport against championship competition. He gave Boston everything he had, and he gave it on the biggest stage there is. But basketball is a team game, and one giant can only do so much. The Celtics had the deeper, more complete roster, and in the end, they took the series in 6 games. Moses had carried Houston farther than anyone had a right to expect, all the way to the doorstep of a title, and still came up short of the prize. You might think a loss like that would haunt a man, define him, leave him bitter. Instead, it set the table for the most important chapter of his entire career. Because the very next season, Moses Malone would put together a stretch of basketball so dominant that it would not only earn him another MVP, it would make him the most coveted free agent in the sport and send him hurtling toward a city, a team, and 4 little words that the game would never, ever forget. If the 1981 finals run was Moses Malone proving he could carry a team, then the season that followed was him proving there was almost no ceiling on what one man could produce. He averaged 31.1 points a game and 14.7 rebounds a night. When the votes were counted, Moses was named the most valuable player of the league for the second time. Sit with that scoring average for a moment. This was a man known above everything for his work on the glass, the relentless second and third efforts, the refusal to let a missed shot die. And yet here he was, finishing as the runner-up for the scoring title, edged out only by George Gervin and his silky touch. The player everyone thought of as a grinder had just shown he could fill it up with the very best pure scorers in the sport. That season also produced 2 individual nights that belong in any conversation about single-game dominance. On the 2nd of February, against San Diego, Moses poured in 53 points, a career high, an explosion from a man who supposedly lived on hustle rather than shot-making. Then, just 9 days later, against Seattle, he grabbed 21 offensive rebounds in a single game, setting a league record. In a window of 9 days, the same man set a personal scoring high and a league rebounding record. Pure scoring on one night, pure relentlessness on the other. A 2-time most valuable player, the owner of records on both ends of the effort spectrum. By every measure the game could put on paper, Moses Malone was one of the 2 or 3 most valuable players alive.
And that is exactly when the business of basketball came calling again. When Moses hit restricted free agency, the Philadelphia 76ers did not tiptoe. On the 2nd of September, 1982, he signed an offer sheet with Philadelphia worth $13.2 million over 6 years. For the early 1980s, that was a staggering sum, the kind of figure that made headlines far beyond the sports pages. The skinny teenager from Petersburg, who had once been sold to settle another team's debts, was now being valued like one of the most precious commodities in professional sports. Under restricted free agency rules, Houston could match the offer and keep him. The franchise had just been sold, and the new owners looked at Moses's roughly $2 million annual salary and decided it did not fit their plans. So they matched the offer and then immediately agreed to trade him away. On the 15th of September, Houston sent Moses to Philadelphia in exchange for veteran center Caldwell Jones and a first-round draft pick. A franchise held a 2-time most valuable player at the very height of his abilities and chose to ship him out for a role player and a draft choice because the new ownership did not want to carry his salary. Once more, a team that held Moses Malone in its hands decided it could live without him. Philadelphia knew exactly what they were getting and exactly why they needed him. The Sixers had just lost the finals to Los Angeles, where Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had outmuscled their entire front court. They already had Julius Erving, Dr. J, one of the most electrifying players in the sport. They had stars. They had style. What they did not have was a dominant big man who could stand toe-to-toe with the best center in basketball. Moses was that missing piece. He arrived in Philadelphia carrying 2 MVP trophies and a quiet reputation as a man who had never won the big one. He had come close, all the way to the finals, and fallen short. But before the playoffs of his first Philadelphia season even began, he would open his mouth and say 3 short syllables that would outlive nearly everything else he ever accomplished. The 1982-83 season turned out to be the perfect marriage of player and team. Moses, with Dr. J alongside him, was exactly what Philadelphia had been missing. When the votes came in, he won the league's highest individual honor for the 2nd straight year, but this time in a different uniform for a different city. That distinction is far rarer than people realize. By winning back-to-back Most Valuable Player awards with 2 different teams, Moses became the only player in league history ever to do it. Widening the lens to all 4 major American professional sports leagues, the record books show that kind of back-to-back honor with 2 different clubs has been matched only a couple of times across generations, by Barry Bonds and much later by Shohei Ohtani. But it was not the trophy that made that spring immortal. It was 4 little words. Before the playoffs began, a reporter asked Moses how he thought the postseason would unfold. In his own plain Southern way of speaking, he predicted Philadelphia would go foe, foe, foe. 4-0, 4-0, 4-0. A clean sweep in each of the 3 rounds it would take to win the championship. This was not loud trash talk. It was not a man pounding his chest for the cameras. It was a quiet, matter-of-fact prediction delivered in the everyday vernacular of a man from Petersburg, Virginia. The simplicity of it, the unpolished, unforgettable rhythm of those 3 syllables is exactly what made it stick. Years later, a major national newspaper would describe the line as an enduring quotation that had earned its own place in the language of the sport. The irony at the heart of all of it, the man with no flashy persona, no carefully crafted media image, no taste for the spotlight,
That very man produced one of the most quoted lines in the history of professional basketball. The phrase grew bigger than the speaker.
But before any of that irony could settle in, there was a prediction to keep. How close did Moses come to making good on his prophecy? Astonishingly close. Philadelphia tore through the 1983 playoffs like a team possessed by the exact certainty their center had described, dropping only a single game the entire run. They swept through the first round, then marched into the finals against the same Los Angeles Lakers who had beaten them a year earlier. And this time, with Moses anchoring the middle, Philadelphia swept them clean, 4-0. The lone defeat came in the conference round, the one blemish that kept the prediction from being letter perfect. The team honored the near miss when the championship rings were made. The inside of the 1983 ring was inscribed with a playful correction of the famous line, a nod to 4, then 5, then 4. Even the jewelry carried a wink at the prophecy. Philadelphia finished the postseason 12 wins against 1 loss. At the time, the most commanding march to a championship the league had ever witnessed. Across the playoff run, Moses averaged 26 points and nearly 16 rebounds a game. In the finals against Los Angeles, he did the one thing Philadelphia had brought him in to do. He took on Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the very center who had humbled the Sixers a year before, and beat him on the boards in stunning fashion, out-rebounding him 72-30 across the series. The missing piece had not just fit the puzzle, he had dismantled the one obstacle that had stood between Philadelphia and a title. Moses was named the most valuable player of the finals. Head coach Billy Cunningham put the whole thing plainly. The difference between the team that lost the year before and the team that now stood as champions was Moses. One man, one addition, one title. The man who had been sold to settle debts, traded for a draft pick and a role player, passed around by a half-dozen franchises, that man now stood on top of the basketball world, a champion at last. And in the glow of that victory, he was about to reveal a side of himself the box scores never could. There is a part of greatness that never shows up in a stat line, and it is one of the most overlooked chapters of the Moses Malone story. For all his quiet, for all his reputation as a man who let his game do the talking, Moses became something rare in a sport built on rivalry and ego. He became a teacher. Around the time of that 1983 championship, Moses began tutoring a young man just arriving on the basketball scene, Hakeem Olajuwon, the future cornerstone of the very Houston franchise Moses himself had once carried. Here was an established superstar, a champion, a multiple-time MVP, choosing to pour his wisdom into a younger center who would eventually become one of the greatest big men the sport ever produced. Moses was passing the torch with his own hands, helping to build the player who would carry Houston to glory in the years to come. The most famous example of Moses the mentor came in Philadelphia. In the 1984 draft, the Sixers selected a young, wildly talented, and gloriously round forward named Charles Barkley. When Barkley reported to training camp, he weighed a remarkable 300 pounds. He had the gifts, the quickness, the instincts, but not yet the discipline or conditioning to match. Moses stepped in, not with speeches, but with the same relentless standard he held himself to. He pushed Barkley, encouraged him, demanded that he get himself into serious professional shape. Under that guidance, Barkley trimmed down to 255 pounds and went on to earn a place on the league's all-rookie team. Hakeem Olajuwon, Charles Barkley. Two of the most celebrated figures the game has ever known. Two future Hall of Famers whose own legends would tower over the sport. Both of them, early in their journeys, were shaped in part by the quiet, demanding hands of Moses Malone. He did not just win championships and pile up rebounds. He helped build the men who would define the next era of basketball. It is one more piece of evidence in the strange puzzle of his legacy. A man whose fingerprints are all over the history of the game, on the floor and off it, who still somehow gets remembered more softly than he should. But while he was lifting up the next generation, his own body, the one he had built and punished for so many years, was beginning to send him warnings he could not ignore. The thing about a game built on collision is that the body keeps a ledger, and eventually that ledger comes due. For more than a decade, Moses Malone had thrown himself into the most violent real estate on the basketball court, the space beneath the rim, where elbows fly and big men lean their full weight into one another all night long. He had built his entire identity on going back up again and again, on absorbing punishment that would have broken lesser men. But every one of those collisions left a mark somewhere inside him. For a while, the brilliance kept right on coming. In the 1984 to 85 season, Moses pulled down 13.1 rebounds a night and led the league on the glass for the 5th straight year. At the time, that streak stood as a record, 5 consecutive seasons as the best rebounder in the entire sport. It is worth being precise about this because the game has moved on since then. That mark of 5 straight rebounding crowns would later be passed by Dennis Rodman, who strung together 7 in a row. But in that moment, in the middle of the 1980s, no one had ever owned the boards for 5 years running the way Moses had. Then came the warning the ledger had been building toward. On the 28th of March, 1986, in a game against Milwaukee, Moses suffered an orbital fracture, a break in the bone around his right eye. There were hopes he might patch himself together and return for the playoffs, the way he had played through so much else. But this time, the injury would not allow it. He was ruled out for the entire postseason. The man who had dragged whole franchises through the spring was forced to watch from the sidelines. It was a small but unmistakable signal. 2 decades of trench warfare on the glass do not come free. And Philadelphia, the city where he had reached the summit, where he had made good on a prophecy and lifted a banner, was about to decide it could move forward without him. The greatest triumph of his life had been won in that uniform. The slow unraveling of his legend was about to begin in someone else's. What followed the Philadelphia years was not a collapse and not a disgrace. It was something quieter and, in its own way, sadder for how it shaped his memory. Moses Malone became a traveler. After a trade sent him to the Washington Bullets, he kept right on producing at a level most players never reach. He was named an All-Star in each of his 2 seasons there, proof that even past his absolute peak, even with that ledger of collisions weighing on him, he was still among the best big men alive. Then he signed as a free agent with the Atlanta Hawks, and in his very first season in that uniform, he earned another All-Star selection, the 12th in a row, and the last of his career. Stop and weigh that number. 12 straight times, across multiple cities and multiple uniforms, the basketball world looked at the field of players and decided Moses Malone belonged among the elite. That is not the resume of a man who should fade from memory. That is the resume of a fixture, a constant, a player so reliable that his greatness became almost expected. And expected greatness, strangely, is the kind people stop talking about
But the travel did not stop. From Atlanta, he moved on to Milwaukee. Then he returned for a time to the very Philadelphia franchise where he had once stood on top of the world. And finally, his long journey came to rest with the San Antonio Spurs, where the career quietly reached its finish line. Add it all up, and the map is staggering. Utah, St. Louis, Buffalo, Houston, Philadelphia, Washington, Atlanta, Milwaukee, San Antonio. 9 different franchises across a career that spanned the better part of 2 decades.
And here is the cruel mechanics of memory. Legends tend to belong to a city. A fan base adopts a great player, carries his banner, tells his stories to the next generation. But how do you fully claim a man who passed through 9 different homes? No single city ever got to own the whole of Moses Malone. His story was scattered, a chapter here and a chapter there, never gathered into one place where a community could keep it burning. When the rebounding finally stopped, the numbers he left behind told a story so enormous it should have guaranteed him a permanent seat among the immortals. So the question only sharpens. Why didn't it? Lay the career out on the table, just the cold totals, and try to argue with it. Combining his work in both the old American Basketball Association and the National Basketball Association, Moses Malone scored 29,580 points, 10th on the all-time list. He pulled down 17,834 rebounds, 3rd all-time. 3rd. In the entire history of organized professional basketball, only 2 men ever grabbed more. He led the NBA in rebounding 6 separate times. He retired as the all-time leader in offensive rebounds, the very category that defined him, the relentless pursuit of the missed shot, having topped both leagues in that statistic a combined 9 times. He was honored 3 times as the league's finest player. He was selected to 12 All-Star games and named to 8 All-NBA teams. He earned a place on the all-time team of the old ABA, and then on both the 50th and the 75th anniversary teams the NBA assembled to crown its greatest figures across generations. In 2001, in his very first year of eligibility, he walked into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, a first ballot enshrinement, the highest honor the sport can bestow, granted without hesitation or debate. Philadelphia retired as number 2. Houston retired as number 24, lifting it to the rafters in the city where the chairman of the boards had first been born. So here is the paradox laid completely bare. By every measure that can be written down, Moses Malone stands among the greatest big men ever to play the game. And yet, the casual fan, the one who can rattle off the legends of his era, often remembers him less vividly than players he outproduced. Why? The answer is not about the basketball. It is about everything around the basketball. He had no flashy media persona to sell. He had no easy catchphrase beyond those 3 quiet syllables from 1983. He was a man of few words in an era that was learning to reward personality as loudly as performance. And his story, as we have seen, was scattered across 9 uniforms, with no single city left to guard the flame. The production built a mountain. The mythology never got built to match it. When the playing finally ended, Moses Malone did not vanish from the game entirely. From 2006 to 2009, he returned to the Philadelphia organization, the place of his greatest glory, to serve as an assistant coach. It was a fitting circle to close. The man who had quietly shaped Hakeem Olajuwon and Charles Barkley in his playing days now stepped formally into the role of teacher, passing along to a new generation the hard-won knowledge
of a body that had punished the glass for 20 years. There was something poetic in that final basketball act. Moses had always been a teacher at heart, even when no one credited him for it. He had built legends with his bare hands. Now, on a coaching staff, he was doing openly what he had done by example for so long, handing down the craft, the work ethic, the refusal to ever consider a missed shot the final word. And then, with very little warning, the story ended. Moses Malone passed away on the 13th of September, 2015, in Norfolk, Virginia. He was 60 years old. The news landed hard across the basketball world, on the men he had mentored, the teammates he had carried, the opponents he had bullied on the boards, and the generation of fans old enough to remember exactly what he had been. The tributes poured in from every corner of the sport, from the superstars who had learned at his side to the franchises that had retired his number. For a man so often described as quiet, so frequently said to lack a loud public persona, the depth of the mourning told its own truth. The people inside the game, the ones who truly knew, had always understood exactly what he was. 60 years, from a fatherless home in Petersburg to the rafters of 2 NBA arenas, from a teenager sold to settle a gone team's debts to a first-ballot Hall of Famer. The journey was over far too soon, but the size of what he left behind would not shrink. If anything, his passing forced the game to confront a debt of its own, the recognition it had never quite paid him while he was alive. So we come back, at the end, to the mystery we started with. How does a man this great end up remembered this softly? We have walked the whole road now. The fatherless boy in Virginia, the teenager who broke the rules to turn pro, the player passed around like a line item before anyone understood what they were holding, the two-time honoree who carried a flawed team to the finals, the missing piece who delivered a city its title and predicted the sweep before it happened. And we have seen the answer take shape along the way. It was never about the basketball. On the court, the verdict is not in dispute. 3rd all-time in rebounds, 10th all-time in points, 3 times the finest player in the league. The man who out-rebounded the great Kareem Abdul-Jabbar more than 2-1 on the sport's biggest stage. The teacher who helped forge 2 of the most celebrated icons of the next generation. By the only measure that should matter, production, dominance, the relentless conquest of the glass night after night for 20 years, Moses Malone has nothing to prove to anyone. The shortfall was always in the storytelling. He was a quiet man in a game that was learning to fall in love with noise. He let his work speak, and his work spoke in a language of effort and repetition that does not make for easy highlight reels or catchy nicknames repeated forever. He scattered his prime across 9 cities, so no single fan base could fully adopt him as its own. He gave the world one unforgettable line, those 3 plain syllables, and almost nothing else for the mythmakers to grab onto. And so the legend stayed smaller than the man. But maybe that is the most honest tribute of all. Moses Malone never needed the myth. He needed the rebound. He needed the next possession, the second effort, the refusal to let a miss be the end of anything. That was the boy from Petersburg who learned early that nobody hands you a thing. And that was the chairman of the boards who turned that hard lesson into one of the greatest careers the sport has ever seen. The numbers are still in the books. The banners still hang. And if his name comes up a little quieter than it should, then perhaps the work falls to those of us who remember to say it louder. he was one of the greatest big men who ever lived. His name was Moses Malone, and the record, the real record, never lied about a single thing he was.